What is going on? It's Alex going back at you with another video, and today it is the beginning of my deep dive series for all 32 teams in the NFL for this upcoming year. If you are new, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Always helps out. Feel free to take advantage of our sponsors. They're in the link tree below. It's a great way for you guys to be able to enjoy special perks because of me. Also sends me a $6 check every time you go and use that UnderDog Fantasy code. So, got to be able to plug that in there, full transparency. But continuing on, this series is going to be a draft class breakdown. It's going to be a roster breakdown, a roster outlook as well, because we're going to be looking at the guys who have contracts that are expiring. And then we are also going to be doing a records prediction for every single game. So it's a robust series. I'm extremely excited for this one. It's something that is a build off of what I did last year. So want to get you guys content. This is going to be based off of my power ranking. So right now Washington is at 32, and that's based on my offensive grade, my defensive grade, and a little bit of an X factor. So like rookie quarterbacks usually push it down a little bit just because there's a little bit of unknowns there. But the thing is, as you can see, I'm not just BSing you by saying that the Commanders are going to be good soon. They have a lot of really good pieces in place. We're going to talk about it. I'm very excited to do so. But you know, we're at the point of the NFL where the 32nd best team is still a team that I have a lot of hope for, and that's a really, really good place to be. Let's talk about the draft class first. Yes, this is imported directly from my draft grades, and we'll go over it as well. But you got the guy at the top, Jayden Daniels. Like, obviously, I love that to death. Great move by you guys on your behalf. He was my QB2. I think he's going to be a good fit as long as he stays protected. We'll talk about that in a moment, though, because I think that's an area for this year where it might be lacking a little bit more than what I would prefer. Johnny Newton was an unbelievable steal there in round 2, so start out the draft red hot. You got Mikey Samer still, which to me, I'm a big fan of Quan Martin, so getting another like high energy slot player to me feel like a little bit of overkill when I think the boundary of the corners really need to be fixed up a bit more. I love Mikey. It's just one of those spots where I didn't really feel like it was necessary. Then we have Ben Sinnott. I'm not the biggest Ben Sinnott guy on planet Earth. I've warmed up to it, though. He's going to be an upgrade for sure. But I think that, you know, at 53, there were bigger issues than tight end. And I didn't really see Ben Sinnott being the biggest impact in terms of that. Brandon Coleman, I'm a big fan of his. At 67, that's a bit early for me, but I do see a ton of potential there. Maybe in a year when he takes over, he actually might be the answer. So again, something to be positive about coming for the future. Then you got Luke McCaffrey at pick 100. That was my least favorite pick. I was just thinking it's way too early. Right now, according to our lads, which is basically how these depth charts are going to be laid out for you, he's projected to be the starter in the slot. We'll see if that actually comes to fruition, but Luke McCaffrey is a good player. To me, he was just a later day 3 guy. When you get him at the end of day 2 with so many really good receivers on the board like Troy Franklin, I did not really see why. The reasoning didn't add up to me. Then Jordan McGee, I'm a big fan of that pick, honestly. He's a really solid linebacker, very much worth developing under your 2 short-term contract linebackers that we'll discuss. Then you got Dominique Hampton, solid big hitting safety there out of Washington, 220 pounds. And then Javonte Jean-Baptiste is a nice rotational edge rusher. So overall, C is adequate, so C+ draft is still very, very respectable. There was really no draft classes this year that really pissed me off besides the Falcons. And so a C+ might sound not very good to you, but I'm a very, very tough grader. So, you know, again, take it actually as a positive, the fact that you guys don't have a non-adequate draft. So it's certainly a good one. But I just thought there were areas where the value didn't really match up. And starting this off, we do have the offense. This is projected by our lads as of this week. So if things change, awesome. If things don't, awesome. Regardless, feel free to leave those comments down below. And of course, yes, things are very much up to being shifted around at this point. But again, there's a reason why depth charts exist. It's to, indicate early on who's projected to get the starting job. So I want to be able to talk about that. As you can see in the bottom right, there is a key, and the players being labeled with certain differentiating colors in the color of the team allows you to be able to see that there are players that have that they're up for a contract. There's guys who are rookies, and then of course I have an MVP for offense and for defense. So super excited about that. Let's get right into this. We'll go from skill position to line, then for defense, line to skill position. Starting with the quarterback, Jayden Daniels. Already highlighted him in the draft class, but Big fan of Jayden Daniels. I think he's going to be a massive addition to y'all's roster for the future as long as he stays healthy and protected. Fortunately, not a huge fan of the offensive line, but again, we'll get to that. Austin Eckler, I'm not a really big fan of like how much he's kind of fallen athletically, but I'm pretty certain that he still brings a good amount of receiving capability, and you do have a nice rotation of running backs on roster, so it's not all hope is lost, but when you're comparing it versus the rest of the NFL, it's certainly a little substandard, or at least it's subpar. Looking at the wide receivers, we got in the slot Luke McCaffrey projected to start. Again, I don't really know if that's going to come to fruition, but I'm excited in case it is. Obviously, McCaffrey name has a lot of weight right now in the NFL. Hopefully, his name actually ends up matching his talent level. So I'm excited for that. Then you got Terry McLaurin. Super underrated at this point. Honestly, I find it to be a little bit disrespectful. The best unit is not right wide receiver and slot wide receiver. It's going to be the left wide receiver in Terry McLaurin as well as Sam Cosmi. Big fan of that. So we adjusted that on the fly. But, Terry McLaurin, I think, is fantastic. Again, super duper underrated. Jahan Dotson doesn't get enough respect either. Both those guys are fantastic receivers. I think you have some good depth there as well in De'Ami Brown. And also, it's a contract year for him. So I would assume for him to be pushing Luke McCaffrey for both of them to perform their best. Looking at tight end, Zach Ertz as well as Ben Sinnott. Good rotation of tight ends in there. It's been better than what you guys have had in the past. Of course, Logan Thomas overperformed for the amount of talent that he has. But continuing on, looking at the offensive line, starting from left to right, Cornelius Lucas, serviceable, nothing crazy. But, again, for a quarterback that is relatively injury prone as Jayden Daniels, I am not over the moon about it. Then you got Allegretti and Sam Cosmi, the guards. I forgot to talk about Wiley, but we'll do that in a second. Cosmi, I already have him listed as one of the best players. It's going to be pretty tough to pay him. He's probably going to get about $25 million a year based on, the contracts that we saw in this offseason. Tyler Biadasz came over from Dallas to follow his coach, so that's pretty awesome. Not really the best center in the world. And then you got Andrew Wiley starting right tackle. So I think that this grade of a C+ is being extremely generous. I'm just thinking about it right now. It is really generous. And it's based on how much I love Jayden Daniels. If I were to have like a standard point of view rather than me being optimistic about Jayden, I think I might give it a C-. Poor running back, relatively poor offensive line, and your weapons, you're pretty much relying on your top two wide receivers to be able to carry you. So I'm even starting to backtrack. It wouldn't change your ranking overall, but certainly is some big concerns there. Now let's continue on to the defense. A lot of dudes up for contract. I'll say it right now. There's a lot of dudes up for a contract. But again, we're going to go from defensive line out to skill position. The edge rushers, both of them are on one-year deals. Both of them are not necessarily guys who I want starting on my team. Cleveland Ferrell and Dorrance Armstrong. I think Dorrance, pretty sure he was there in Dallas, so it's cool to have some instant connection there with Quinn, but not really a huge fan of what he's bringing to the table. I thought edge rusher was a position that was critical to draft, and of course, you ended up getting Jerzon Newton, who is awesome, but you have arguably the best defensive interior in the entire NFL, with Payne, Allen, as well as Newton. Really interesting. You could even put Newton as an edge rusher because he had played some reps there over Illinois. I think that would be actually very smart early on, so that he gets more and more reps. Look at the linebackers. You got Bobby Wagner, Frankie Louvu. Again, these are the main starters based on our lads. These are depth charts. But, looking at other linebackers that you have, Jamin Davis, unfortunately a bust of a first-round pick. He's had his flashes, but, when you get Frankie Louvu to come to the table and sign a relatively solid deal, it's kind of hard to say no. Looking at those safeties, though, you got Jeremy Chin, Derek Forrest, both up for contracts. So maybe you could justify the Mikey Sainristil selection if you want to put Quan Martin to free safety to replace Derek Forrest. I don't think that's going to be the case, though. But the big kick in the nuts are the boundary corners. Of course, we already talked about Mikey Sainristil. Big fan of his game. Same thing with Quan Martin. Even Emmanuel Forbes. Kind of all those guys probably should be pushed into the slot. But looking at the boundaries, Benjamin St. Juste, he's not, again, these guys aren't awful. It's just, for starting caliber corners in the NFL, these guys might be the worst starting caliber corner core because you usually have one guy who's a marquee stud, and Right now, you're going to be banking on Mike Sainristil still to carry you in the nickel when a lot of these really talented receivers play on the outside. So I'm certainly worried about that nonetheless. But, it's a team that certainly has really good pieces. I love the fact that Bobby Wagner and, Frankie Louver are on the squad. That's a huge upgrade. And again, you got Jeremy Chin there. So I can't really crap on y'all too much, but there are some key weaknesses. So let's end up going right into the records predictions and see how this team fares in their schedule. And we are into playoff predictors. This is going to be what I use for all 32 teams. And yes, if we end up deciding a game as a loss and, I end up looking, for example, over the Buccaneers roster, I'm like, man, I've already looked at all of them. So I'm actually 10 times as informed as I usually am where I make this series as I make the slides. So, but maybe there's just something that I look over the roster and I just get this win where I'm like, man, I gave Tampa the win. And then, I think Washington can actually pull this one out. This is obviously subject to change, but this is the most informed I've ever been. I usually love these instant reactions where I can end up falling in love with the team on the spot. Probably not going to be the case since we're talking about the number 32 team. That does not mean you guys are going to have the worst record. I'm just going to call that out. This is just terms of roster prowess, power ranking wise. But let's go right into this. Starting out with week number 1, we have the Commanders going versus the Buccaneers. You are in Tampa Bay. You're going against a seasoned team that, a lot of people, including myself, are not really big fans of because they're aging. Baker has a limited ceiling and their edge rushers are significantly worse. Well, lucky for these edge rushers, they're going up against arguably one of the worst tackle duos in the NFL. And they're also going against Jayden Daniels, who is having his first NFL start with a poor O-line. I am going to be electing to go after Tampa. Again, even if it were a more even match, I think that, being in Tampa, at 3:25 p.m. in the middle of summer, it's going to lean towards a team that's a little more comfortable in Florida. Let's put it that way. Of course, to be fair, Jayden did play at LSU. Not like he doesn't know how to play in that type of climate, but again, home teams usually are just a lot more comfortable on their own. At week number 2, we have a division game. New York goes to Washington. Again, this is early on in Jayden Daniels' career. Again, this entire year is, but at the same time, he's still getting used to playing an NFL quarterback position, right? You're going up against Brian Burns as well as Kayvon Thibodeau. To be fair, I think that the receiving core outmatches the secondary for the Giants, but I don't think it outmatches it significantly to the point where I do think the Giants can't beat the Washington Commanders. So I actually do think Brian Dable's going to pull this one out. It's going to certainly be a tough battle, but I think if this were later in the year, I would give this one to Washington. Week number 3, you're going to Cleveland or not Cleveland, excuse me, Cincinnati, Ohio. And you're going to be playing Joe Burrow and the Bengals. I hate to say it, you're going to have a tough stretch to start. At week number 4, the Commanders go to Scottsdale, Arizona to face the Cardinals. And this is a potentially winnable game. The corner core for the Cardinals is extremely short. The interior defensive line for the Cardinals is extremely weak. So you could actually be able to run the ball against them. The linebacker core, not so great. The edge rushing core, developmental. So the defense certainly is a potential liability for the Cardinals. And that could be where, especially when linebackers are potentially not going to be able to track Jayden Daniels as well, that might be something that could end up working. And the interior of the offensive line is actually not that good, in my opinion, for Arizona. So when you have the best defensive interior in the NFL, and the Giants have one of the best coaches now coming in from the Raiders, I trust him to develop that O-line much better than the Arizona Cardinals. I think this is going to be where the first slip up happens. Again, you could end up seeing Marvin Harrison Jr. just absolutely toast the secondary. But I think the interior pressure of the Commanders might be an X factor to call for an upset there in Scottsdale. Although I do think, logically speaking, it should be an Arizona win. But at week number 5, you have the Browns going up against the Commanders. The Browns are a supercharged team. They have a relatively inconsistent quarterback compared to what he should be in Deshaun Watson. But I think that even with the Deshaun Watson factor in here, the team is just so damn good it's almost impossible to beat the Browns if you have key weaknesses on your offense, including the offensive line. So the Browns are going to take that one right there. Same thing for the Ravens. I mean, you're talking about Roquan Smith here. So Roquan Smith is going to pretty much mitigate any form of mobility that Jayden Daniels has. I usually like to look at the linebackers as a way to see how much wiggle room these quarterbacks have to be able to escape. And I think Roquan's just a little bit too smart. You have good speed there with Trenton Simpson as well. So I'm going to be going for the Ravens. Week 7, this is a fun one. You got Carolina going to Washington. So, they're not too far away. It's not going to be insane in terms of the climate difference. So it's not like we're talking about Minnesota going to Miami. But Carolina is underrated. They are. And, to be fair, it's one of the defensive line to offensive line matchups that's not too much into the defense's favor. The edge rushers for the Panthers aren't super stellar. But I do think that, JC Horn, when healthy, we're going to project that guy stay healthy as well. So, again, I could project Jayden Daniels getting injured, and it'll be even worse for y'all. But I do think that Canales is going to bring a new energy to the table that wasn't there before. And the poor edge rushing crew from the Commanders, from you guys, unfortunately, I am actually going to give the Panthers the win in this one. The Bears are coming off a bye week. Granted, they are going to Washington. But I think the Bears are really, really talented. And they're a team that deserves a ton of respect. I even knocked their grade down a little bit because they have a rookie quarterback as well. But the Bears are much more complete. They had a top 5 defense over the latter half of last year, and they only got better. So big fan of the Bears this year, and not a shame to you guys. But Washington then goes to New York later in the year. This is a game that you could win, but again, it's a supreme edge rushing core, so I don't really see very much time being available. So I do think the slot matchup is the biggest one between receiver and corner. And I think Luke McCaffrey is 10 times outmatched by Andrew Phillips. So I think that you guys essentially are outmatched the majority of this. And Brian Dable also will be trying to fight for his job. So it's going to be a tough year for you guys, but there's a lot of hope on the horizon. If you get a good set of offensive tackles, I think this instantly flips a couple of these games in here. The Steelers are coming off a rest week again. This is the sucky thing about your schedule. It's really tough. There's some damn good teams on here. And the teams where I think, like, hey, if you're coming off a bye week versus the Steelers, like, there is a chance that you could end up upsetting them. But the Steelers are very, very underrated this year. I don't really understand why people are, pretty much, so to speak, speeding. That's for the Chiefs, apparently. Spitting on the Steelers' chances of actually being able to make a run. But of course, you face the Eagles at home in week 11. That's super tough. That's a tough one. You can't imagine going to Philadelphia and beating Philly, who still has one of the best rosters in the NFL. You have a miniature bye week, if I'm not mistaken. Yep. So it's a Thursday to Sunday. There you go. You got miniature bye week going up against the Dallas Cowboys, who I think are going to struggle much more than expected this year. But again, you got Eric Kendricks there, Micah Parsons. I just think this team is too unprepared to be able to compete versus the Cowboys. So I think you guys will sneak a win in there. At week 13, you got the Titans going to Washington. Granted, Tennessee to Washington is not a vast difference. So I'm not going to really factor too much of a climate differential, but there's still home field advantage here for sure. But I do think that when you look at the offensive line versus defensive line battle, like, the interior for the Titans is vastly improved. They've actually grabbed a lot of talent in terms of, you got JC Latham. You also have Peter Skoronski. Was it Aaron Brewer who you guys brought on? I'm forgetting if that was Lloyd Cushenberry. One of the two. You brought on a center in the offseason. Like, there's not really very many places except for right tackle that I think can be exploited. But even the right tackle spot, it's a pretty fair matchup versus Dorrance Armstrong. So I do worry about that a little bit. And then you have Jeffrey Simmons on the other side, Harold Landry, Arden Key. And then you also have L'Jarius Sneed, who I think is an absolute stud. I really do think the Titans are extremely underrated. They're one of the better teams coming into this year. And if Will Levis takes a step up, my God, you got to watch out. At pick number 15, we're still in mock draft mode. At week 15, coming off the bye, we're going to New Orleans to go against the Saints. The Saints are a team where I could totally see them having these hiccups. I don't know if Ryan Ramchik's even going to play this year because he has no cartilage in his knee. So there's certainly a chance that he isn't even on the field. If he is, I mean, there's certainly a bit of a tougher matchup, but I do see that like this is a very high octane defense with an elite linebacking core, going up against a team where this would have to be an upset, but they are fully rested. I think Dan Quinn can maximize the defense, and I don't trust Derek Carr to pull this one out. So we'll actually give Washington a sneaky win right there. Eagles end up going to you guys. I don't see you splitting this series with the Eagles. Already talked about it earlier. They're one of the best teams in the NFL still. Week 17, it would be awesome for you to be able to edge a win out versus a playoff caliber team at this point, but I just don't see it. I think Atlanta's going to be really trying to push. If they end up resting their starters, that's going to be a different story entirely. But I really do believe that, like, thinking about what the Panthers are going to do, the Saints are going to do, the Buccaneers, I can't see the Falcons necessarily taking their foot off the gas pedal at this point. I don't see it being that far or like that big of a gap to where they can end up resting their starters. If they do, I'm giving Washington this win 10 out of 10 times, but I just can't see that happening, unfortunately. And Dallas is going to be actually trying to make a push for the playoffs. They usually end up blowing it, but I feel like they're going to have a little bit of a tougher time than what we believe. Again, if this were switched in the end and maybe Washington had this game, maybe it would be that way where I would actually see if I could put a win for Washington, but I just can't. So Washington goes 2-15 this year. The thing is, you have a really tough schedule, right? You're facing your own division, which is arguably one of the best in football. You're facing the AFC North too, which is, again, one of the best, if not the best division in football. Then you're facing a lot of teams that are really, really strong. So I had to pull 2 upsets in order to give you guys the wins required. And those are versus very good teams. So if you want to know a realistic range, I do think it's possible that, especially with an injury to Jayden Daniels, God forbid, you could be winless this year. But it's just a super tough schedule. You're going up against playoff teams every single week. Maybe you can pull out a win there in week 13 versus the Titans, but I just can't really see very many games, like maybe week 7 as well. I think the ceiling would be probably 6 wins. So 0-6, landing on 2, because I'm just personally really, really optimistic about the Bears, the Titans, as well as the Panthers. So I know it sucks, but you guys definitely need to keep hopeful because your team has a lot of really good foundational pieces. They just need to be something that you build around. And unfortunately, Dan Quinn hasn't had enough time or capital to really build a roster that wins now, and that's okay. Just be patient. You finally have a good organization. Just give it some time. Thank you so much for watching. Love y'all. See you on the far side.